In late 1941, Hong Kong was a British Crown colony at the mouth of the Pearl River, a compact territory of Hong Kong Island, Kowloon, and the new territories holding around 1,500,000 inhabitants. Its deep-water harbor made it a major entrepot for South China, a center for banking and shipping, and a relay point between Chinese markets and global trade routes. The colony's significance was therefore both local, as a gateway to Guangdong, and international, as a symbol of British influence in East Asia. The preconditions for conflict around Hong Kong were shaped by two converging processes: the decline of Britain's relative power in the Pacific and the expansion of the Japanese Empire on the Asian mainland. The Anglo-Japanese alliance lapsed in the early 1920s, and by the 1930s, Tokyo pursued an independent course, occupying Manchuria in 1931 and escalating into full-scale war with China in 1937. In October 1938, Japanese forces captured Canton, Guangzhou, cutting the main Chinese supply corridor to Hong Kong and placing the colony within a perimeter of Japanese-controlled territory. For Chinese authorities in Chongqing, Hong Kong became a vulnerable enclave adjacent to occupied zones. For Japan, it was an exposed British base on the flank of operations in South China. British planners viewed Hong Kong through the lens of the wider Singapore strategy. Limited naval and air resources were to be concentrated at Singapore, while Hong Kong, close to Japanese airfields and within artillery range of the mainland, was increasingly regarded as difficult to hold against a major assault. Staff studies in the 1930s nonetheless led to the construction of fixed defenses, most notably the Gin Drinkers Line across the hills of the new territories, intended to delay an enemy advance long enough for diplomatic or strategic adjustments elsewhere. By 1940, however, the British government designated Hong Kong as an outpost and decided not to commit the substantial sea and air forces that would have been required to guarantee its defense. From Tokyo's perspective, the colony figured in a broader southern advance strategy. As Japan moved into French Indochina in 1940 to 1941 and faced tightening American and British economic embargoes, military planners sought to neutralize Allied bases along sea lanes to Southeast Asia. Hong Kong's harbor and dock facilities could support Allied submarines, merchant shipping, and intelligence work against Japanese traffic in the South China Sea. Conversely, their capture would remove a British foothold on the China coast and provide an additional anchorage and administrative center for operations in Guangdong and beyond. By December 1941, the Hong Kong Garrison had become a multi-ethnic force. Official figures for personnel mobilized on 8 December list 14,564 troops, 3,652 British regulars, 2,428 local colonial personnel, 2,254 Indian Army troops, 2,112 in auxiliary defense units, 1,787 members of the Hong Kong Volunteer Defense Corps, 1,982 Canadians, and 136 nurses. These formations were supported by a handful of Royal Navy vessels and 5 operational aircraft, mostly obsolete types. For the British and colonial administration, this mix reflected both imperial manpower networks and the limited resources that could be spared from other theaters. The decision by Canada to send Sea Force in autumn 1941 added a further layer of political and military context. Ottawa agreed to dispatch nearly 2,000 personnel from the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Canada, plus a small headquarters and medical detachment, sailing from Vancouver at the end of October and arriving in mid-November. Canadian leaders sought to demonstrate commitment to imperial defense and gain operational experience for their army, while accepting British assurances that the reinforcements would increase the garrison's deterrent value. Critics within Canadian staff circles questioned the quality of equipment and training for a potential high-intensity campaign in Asia, but the deployment proceeded. Opposite them, the Imperial Japanese Army assembled the 38th Infantry Division under Lieutenant General Takashi Sakai, supported by additional artillery and engineer units, and by around 51 aircraft and several warships. Japanese commanders anticipated that the destruction or surrender of the Hong Kong garrison would be achievable in a limited period, given their numerical superiority and control of the surrounding mainland intelligence compiled from consular sources. Aerial reconnaissance and previous operations in China suggested that British field forces in the region were stretched and that Hong Kong's fixed defenses could be bypassed or reduced with concentrated artillery and air power. For the largely Chinese civilian population, the approach of war came after years of displacement and economic strain. Refugees from neighboring provinces, particularly after the fall of Canton, had moved into Hong Kong, contributing to overcrowding, housing shortages, and competition for work. Alongside the formal colonial structures, Chinese political networks operated in the territory and across the border. Early anti-Japanese guerrilla groups in Guangdong, which would later be organized into the East River Column, had already begun small-scale actions against occupation forces and maintained contacts with local supporters and some Allied representatives. On the eve of the Pacific War, therefore, Hong Kong stood at the junction of several strategic calculations. British and Canadian leaders hoped that a reinforced but limited garrison could either deter an attack or impose a delay useful to Allied operations elsewhere. Japanese planners saw the colony as one objective among many in a coordinated offensive designed to break Allied resistance in East and Southeast Asia. Civilians, soldiers, and officials inside the territory faced an uncertain future, informed by the wider course of the Sino-Japanese War and by their own, often conflicting expectations of what an assault on the colony would entail. In the early hours of 8 December 1941, while news of the attack on Pearl Harbor had not yet fully reached the colony, Japanese forces on the mainland opposite Hong Kong began their offensive shortly after dawn. Aircraft from nearby Japanese airfields struck Kai Tak Airfield and key installations. The small number of British and Commonwealth aircraft based in the colony, including obsolete reconnaissance and training types, were caught largely on the ground and disabled or destroyed within the first raids. The loss of air assets at the outset removed any significant Allied ability to contest Japanese air superiority over the territory. Simultaneously, Japanese artillery and infantry units of the 38th Division moved into forward positions north of the Sham-Chun, Shenzhen River, which marked the border between the new territories and Guangdong. Forward observation posts on Hong Kong's side reported increased activity, but had limited means to interfere. The colony's defense plan, which divided the garrison into mainland and island brigades under Major General Christopher Maltby, now shifted from a heightened alert state to active implementation. The mainland brigade, comprising British, Indian, and local units, was responsible for delaying actions in the new territories and along the Gin Drinkers line. The island brigade prepared fallback positions on Hong Kong Island itself. On the Japanese side, Lieutenant General Takashi Sakai's command structure linked army formations with naval and air components to ensure coordinated strikes. The initial priority was to neutralize communications, observation points, and transportation hubs. Radio masts, power stations, and road junctions in the new territories were identified as early targets to limit the defenders' ability to shift reserves or to direct artillery fire accurately. Japanese staff officers sought a rapid breakdown of organized resistance on the mainland portion of the colony, anticipating that geography would then confine the defenders to the island for a second phase. The British colonial administration, led by Governor Sir Mark Young, convened emergency meetings in Central as reports of air raids and border fighting arrived. Civil defense procedures, long discussed in planning documents, were put into effect. Air raid sirens sounded, blackout regulations were enforced, and designated shelters were opened. Police units, auxiliary services, and volunteer organizations were tasked with traffic control, firefighting, and medical assistance. For many residents, particularly recent refugees from neighboring provinces, these measures were received against the background of previous experience with Japanese air attacks on Chinese cities, influencing both expectations and patterns of civilian movement. Within the garrison, orders clarified the chain of command for the unfolding crisis. Major General Maltby retained overall command of land forces, while naval elements reported to the flag officer in command of local Royal Navy and Allied ships. Coordination with Chinese nationalist authorities on the mainland remained limited and largely informal. There were contacts with local Chinese groups, but no integrated operational command structure. The Canadian contingent, still relatively unfamiliar with the terrain after their November arrival, completed final adjustments to defensive positions and communications as they received confirmation that hostilities had begun. For Japanese soldiers and forward units, the opening phase was framed as part of a wider campaign against British and American power in Asia. Operational briefings emphasized the need for speed and discipline in crossing rivers, seizing hill features, and exploiting any gaps in the defenders' lines. On the ground, this translated into reconnaissance patrols, testing the strength of outposts and artillery units, registering their guns on ridgelines and fortified points along the gin drinkers' line. Among Hong Kong's Chinese population, the first day of open hostilities produced varied reactions. Some residents moved toward the perceived safety of inner urban districts, crowding ferries and tram lines, while others attempted to leave the colony by boat or overland routes, despite increasing restrictions. Commercial firms tried to secure documents, cash reserves, and essential records. Local employees in dockyards, utilities, and hospitals were instructed to remain at their posts, creating tensions between obligations to families and to workplaces designated as vital to the defense effort. The opening phase thus combined rapid military action with abrupt administrative and civilian transitions. Defenders shifted from a posture of uneasy expectation to one of immediate engagement, while Japanese forces implemented a prearranged plan designed to dismantle the colony's capacity to resist in stages. The interaction between airstrikes, border clashes, and emergency civil measures in these first hours set the conditions under which subsequent engagements in the new territories and around the gin drinkers' line would unfold. Strategic planning for the battle developed within the wider framework of simultaneous Japanese operations across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo authorized a coordinated opening offensive against British, American, and Dutch positions, expecting that several near-simultaneous blows would disrupt Allied decision-making and delay any unified response. Within this plan, Hong Kong was assigned a limited but specific role. Its rapid reduction would remove a British base on the China coast, free the 38th Division for later use in the Philippines or the Dutch East Indies, and secure Japanese supply routes along the South China Sea. For the Japanese 38th Division, staff work before December 1941 identified three main operational phases. First, a swift penetration of the new territories, dismantling outposts and forcing the defenders behind the gin drinkers' line. Second, a concentrated assault to break that line, using artillery, airstrikes, and infantry infiltration to seize key ridges and road junctions. Third, after pushing Allied forces back to Hong Kong Island, an amphibious crossing under cover of darkness and air superiority to establish bridgeheads on the northern shore of the island, followed by a systematic advance toward Victoria and Aberdeen. Engineers prepared bridging equipment, landing craft, and demolition parties in anticipation of destroyed infrastructure. Japanese logistical planning took into account the limited size of the battlefield, but also its rugged terrain. Supply columns were organized to move along existing roads from Shenzhen and Canton, supplemented by local requisition of transport and labor. Ammunition and fuel dumps were established close enough to support intensive artillery and air operations for an estimated campaign of several weeks, even though commanders hoped to achieve success more rapidly. Intelligence officers compiled maps from survey data and commercial publications, marking slopes, reservoirs, tunnels, and coastal batteries. The expectation was that careful preparation would offset the defenders' familiarity with the ground. On the British and Commonwealth side, planning was shaped by the assumption that Hong Kong could not be relieved quickly by sea or air. Naval estimates indicated that major capital ships and carriers were committed elsewhere or vulnerable to land-based aircraft in confined waters. As a result, the defense scheme focused on a controlled withdrawal. Mainland forces were to delay the enemy in the new territories, then fall back in good order to prepared positions on the island, destroying bridges and facilities that could facilitate a crossing. The Gin Drinkers Line, a chain of bunkers, trenches, and artillery positions stretching across the peninsula, was intended to hold for at least several weeks. Logistical stocks inside the colony reflected this concept. The administration and garrison had built up food reserves calculated to support the military and civilian population for a period of months, with rationing plans to extend endurance if necessary. Fuel depots, water reservoirs, and power generation facilities were mapped into the defense plan, with contingencies for partial destruction to deny them to an occupying force. However, munitions and heavy equipment were limited. Artillery pieces and coastal guns included some modern weapons, but also older models, and ammunition expenditure rates were constrained by supply estimates that had to be balanced against other Imperial theaters. From a doctrinal perspective, British officers applied interwar views of fortress defense to the specific geography of Hong Kong. They relied on prepared strongpoints, interlocking fields of fire, and coastal batteries to inflict attrition on any attacker attempting to cross narrow channels or land on exposed beaches. Infantry training emphasized holding fixed positions and conducting local counterattacks rather than mobile warfare on a broad front. Canadian battalions, recently arrived, had to adapt their training to steep slopes, limited road networks, and a dense urban area that could become a final defensive zone. Indian and local units were integrated into this system with varying levels of equipment and experience. Propaganda and information management formed another component of planning on both sides. Japanese authorities framed the coming operations as part of a campaign to expel Western colonial influence from East Asia, preparing leaflets and broadcasts aimed at Chinese residents and colonial troops, encouraging surrender or neutrality. British and colonial officials prepared public statements designed to maintain order, emphasize the legitimacy of the existing administration, and discourage collaboration. Civil defense posters, radio announcements, and press guidance outlined expected behavior during air raids and emergencies, aiming to prevent panic that could complicate military movements. Miscalculations were embedded in these plans. Japanese commanders estimated that the defenders, outnumbered and without prospects of large-scale reinforcement, would be worn down swiftly by air and artillery pressure. They anticipated that the Gin Drinkers Line could be breached in days rather than weeks, if key positions were taken by night assaults. On the other side, some British and Canadian officers still believed that the defensive system in the new territories would impose a more prolonged delay, underestimating the capacity of the Japanese infantry to move through rugged ground and exploit gaps. Both sides recognized the importance of morale, but interpreted it through their own institutional experiences and prior campaigns, shaping their expectations of how quickly units and civilian populations might reach breaking points under sustained pressure. In this way, the strategic goals and planning for the Battle of Hong Kong combined global calculations with local constraints. For Japan, the colony was one objective within a larger design to secure a resource sphere and neutralize Allied bases for Britain and its Commonwealth partners. It was a fortified outpost to be held as long as possible, despite acknowledged limitations. The interaction between these planning assumptions would become clear as the first engagements along the Gin Drinkers Line began to test both the operational concepts and the logistical foundations underlying them. The first major clashes unfolded in the new territories as Japanese units began probing attacks against outposts north of the Gin Drinkers Line. On the 8th and 9th of December, infantry elements crossed the Sham Chun River at multiple points, using pontoon bridges, local ferries, and fords identified in pre-war reconnaissance forward British and Indian detachments, including companies from the Royal Scots and the 214th Punjab Regiment, engaged these crossings with small arms and limited artillery support, attempting to slow the advance while avoiding encirclement. Initial encounters demonstrated the attackers' willingness to move by night and along steep, wooded slopes that were difficult to observe from fixed positions. As Japanese patrols widened their frontage, the pattern of contacts shifted from scattered skirmishes to more sustained engagements around key features commanding roads and reservoirs. Hilltops and ridgelines overlooking approaches to the Gin Drinkers Line became contested zones. Defenders used pre-sighted machine gun emplacements and mortars to cover likely avenues of approach, while Japanese forces replied with mortars and field guns brought forward along narrow roads. Communications lines, often dependent on field telephones laid across rough ground, were vulnerable to shell fire and movement, leading some platoons to operate for periods with only fragmentary information on neighboring units. Civilians in the northern New Territories were caught between the advancing troops. Villages near the border saw rapid changes in control as Japanese units moved through and Allied detachments withdrew or counterattacked. Some inhabitants left their homes, carrying portable belongings toward the south, while others remained, hoping to avoid notice by staying indoors or continuing agricultural work where possible reports of requisitioned food, commandeered transport animals, and occasional destruction of buildings near suspected defensive positions contributed to an atmosphere of uncertainty. But the short duration of control changes in these early days limited the establishment of any stable occupation regime. The gin drinkers' line itself came under direct assault on December 9th and 10th. This defensive system, running across high ground from tidewater to tidewater, included bunkers, trenches, barbed wire, and artillery positions, oriented to cover major roads and likely crossing points. One of its strong points, the Shingmun Redoubt, occupied a ridge overlooking the Shingmun Reservoir and controlled approaches toward Kowloon. Japanese staff identified this sector as a potential weak link, believing that if it could be taken by surprise, the line might be turned and its defenders forced into a rapid retreat. Night operations became a defining feature of the first engagements along the line. Japanese infantry companies advanced in darkness, using local guides and compass bearings to approach wire obstacles and pillboxes from less expected directions. Infiltration tactics sought to bypass some positions and attack others from the rear or flanks rather than directly up slopes covered by interlocking fire. In several instances, small groups reached bunker entrances or communication trenches before being detected, leading to close-quarter fighting in confined spaces where numerical advantage and prior knowledge of fields of fire were difficult to exploit fully. For the defenders, these attacks exposed practical limits in the design and manning of the line. Some positions were undermanned relative to their intended wartime strength, and the steep terrain complicated mutual support between adjacent strongpoints. When one bunker or redoubt was penetrated, neighboring positions could find their lines of communication threatened, or their fire plans disrupted by the presence of enemy troops in unexpected locations. Commanders faced decisions about whether to commit reserves to local counterattacks, risking isolation, or to begin phased withdrawals to secondary positions closer to Kowloon. Morale during these early engagements varied across units. Some British, Indian, Canadian, and local troops experienced their first sustained combat under conditions of continuous shelling, air attack, and night infiltration. The destruction of Kai Tak's aircraft and the visible presence of Japanese aircraft over the battlefield reinforced the sense of operating without air support. At the same time, successful local actions, such as repelling assault groups from individual bunkers or inflicting casualties on patrols probing wire entanglements, provided short-term boosts to confidence and were noted in unit reports. Urban areas to the south, particularly Kowloon and the densely populated districts near the harbor, felt the indirect effects of these first clashes. Artillery fire occasionally overshot or fell close to civilian neighborhoods, prompting movement toward shelters and lower-lying areas. Harbor traffic adapted to blackout regulations and the risk of air attack, with some merchant ships preparing to depart or scuttle rather than be captured. Hospitals began to receive an increasing number of wounded soldiers and civilians, testing medical staff and supplies that had been stockpiled in anticipation of an air and artillery campaign. By the end of the first days of fighting, the initial engagements had established a pattern that would shape the remainder of the battle on the mainland. Japanese forces demonstrated an ability to combine artillery preparation, air strikes, and infantry infiltration in difficult terrain, while defenders sought to leverage fixed positions and local counterattacks to impose delays. The pressure on the gin drinkers' line intensified, and decisions about holding or abandoning specific sectors would soon determine whether the new territories could continue to serve as a buffer or whether the conflict would shift decisively to the shores of Hong Kong Island. As fighting intensified along the Gin Drinkers line, pressure on key strongpoints increased to a critical level. The night assault on Shing Mun Redoubt, conducted by selected Japanese companies moving along steep ravines and narrow paths, achieved a penetration that had strategic consequences beyond its local scale. Once Japanese troops secured bunkers and communication trenches on the ridge, they were able to threaten adjoining positions and observe routes leading south toward Kowloon. For the defenders, the loss of this node undermined confidence in the assumption that the line could hold for several weeks. Command reports reaching Major General Maltby during December 10th indicated that several sectors were under simultaneous stress. Some companies had been reduced in strength by casualties and fatigue, while others reported ammunition shortages for mortars and machine guns. Attempts to organize counterattacks against recently lost positions encountered artillery fire and the risk of further encirclement. With Japanese units now appearing behind or on the flanks of certain strongpoints, the prospect of an orderly defense of the entire line diminished rapidly. Decisions taken in this period reflected the shift from planned delay to crisis management. Maltby and his senior officers concluded that holding the Gin Drinkers line in its entirety was no longer feasible and ordered a staged withdrawal toward positions closer to Kowloon. This meant abandoning some bunkers and prepared emplacements that had taken years to build. Engineers received orders to destroy bridges, culverts, and ammunition dumps that could not be evacuated. Rear guards, composed of mixed detachments from British, Indian, and local units, remained in place to cover the movement of main bodies, accepting the risk of being cut off. The withdrawal placed heavy strain on transport and medical services. Vehicles moved along congested roads under intermittent air attack and shell fire. Wounded personnel had to be ferried to aid posts and hospitals already operating near capacity. In some cases, stretchers were carried by hand down steep slopes where vehicles could not pass. Communication difficulties meant that marching columns did not always receive updated information about enemy movements, increasing the danger of contact in unfavorable terrain. For civilians in the new territories and northern Kowloon, the escalation of combat and the visible retreat of Allied units confirmed that the front was moving toward the urban core. Villages along main roads saw streams of troops, vehicles, and refugees passing through in both directions. Rumors spread rapidly, sometimes exaggerating or distorting events, but shaping decisions about whether to stay, move into the city, or attempt to leave the colony entirely. Local authorities tried to maintain basic services and distribute limited supplies, but the pace of military developments complicated any coherent civilian policy. Inside Kowloon, artillery and air attacks intensified once Japanese units reached positions from which they could engage harbor installations and densely built districts. Shells and bombs struck warehouses, residential blocks, and infrastructure, causing fires and damaging water and power systems. Air raid shelters and basements filled with residents. Medical staff worked extended shifts as casualty numbers rose among both soldiers and civilians. The distinction between front line and rear became less clear as the range of Japanese guns extended over areas previously considered relatively secure. At the level of higher command and politics, the crisis period highlighted constraints on external assistance. Communications with London, Ottawa, and Chongqing informed political leaders of the deteriorating situation, but could not alter the immediate balance of forces. British and Canadian governments monitored reports and issued public statements praising the defense and acknowledging the gravity of events, while Chinese authorities viewed the fighting as part of the broader conflict along the South China coast. However, naval and air assets required for any relief operation were committed elsewhere or en route to other theaters. Within the Garrison leadership, debates emerged over how long to continue fighting on the mainland, and when to concentrate all forces on Hong Kong Island. Naval officers stressed the vulnerability of shipping in the harbor under sustained air and artillery attack, and the need to move remaining vessels out of range or scuttle them to prevent capture. Army commanders emphasized the importance of preserving infantry strength for the anticipated second phase of the battle, once the island became the primary defensive zone. Morale during this escalation phase showed contrasting trends. Some units reported continued willingness to fight and cited successful local actions during rearguard engagements. Others displayed signs of exhaustion and uncertainty, as positions thought to be strong were lost in rapid succession. The awareness that there was no prospect of large-scale reinforcement influenced attitudes toward risk, especially in discussions about counterattacks versus further withdrawals. For many Chinese civilians, the crisis confirmed expectations formed during earlier phases of the Sino-Japanese War, reinforcing a sense that urban spaces could quickly become battlefields. By the time Allied forces began to complete their evacuation from the Kowloon Peninsula toward Hong Kong Island, the battle had entered a new stage. The escalation of combat in the new territories and around the Gindrinkers line had resulted in a compressed timetable, forcing commanders to alter plans under pressure. The colony's urban and administrative centers now faced direct exposure to shelling and potential ground assault, and the remaining defenders had to reorganize their positions, logistics, and civil defense arrangements around the more confined geography of the island itself. Once Allied forces completed their withdrawal from Kowloon to Hong Kong Island, the fighting reached its most concentrated phase. Japanese units occupied the peninsula, moved artillery to commanding positions, and began systematic bombardment across the harbor. Guns on the mainland engaged dockyards, oil storage tanks, power stations, and residential districts, while observers on high ground adjusted fire on visible targets such as naval facilities and road junctions. On the island, defenders reorganized into East and West brigades, each responsible for sectors divided by the central ridgeline and key gaps that controlled movement between north and south shores. The island's geography shaped all subsequent decisions. A series of hills and reservoirs formed a spine from the eastern Liamen area through features such as Mount Parker, Jardine's Lookout, and Mount Nicholson toward the Pok Fu Lam and Aberdeen regions. Control of gaps and roads across this terrain, especially Wong Nai Chung Gap, determined whether forces on the eastern side could link with those on the western side. British, Canadian, Indian, and local units prepared company and platoon positions along this ridge system, supported by artillery batteries in place to cover likely landing beaches and inland approach routes. Japanese commanders, having secured Kowloon, decided to cross the narrow channel at night to reduce exposure to artillery and remaining coastal guns. On December 18th, infantry from regiments of the 38th Division embarked in landing craft, motor launches, and requisition boats for multiple crossing points between North Point and the Liamen area. The plan envisaged simultaneous landings along a broad front, followed by rapid advances inland to seize high ground before dawn. Despite some confusion in navigation and losses among craft damaged by artillery and machine gun fire, several substantial groups reached the rocky shorelines and seawalls of the northern coast. Defensive positions along these beaches, manned by elements of the Royal Rifles of Canada, Hong Kong Volunteer Defense Corps, and other units, engaged the landing parties with small arms and automatic weapons. In some sectors, attackers were held up at the water's edge or forced to seek cover among seawalls and industrial structures. In others, Japanese troops managed to move quickly away from the shore, using nullahs, side streets, and slopes to avoid sustained fire. Once inland, they aimed to converge on junctions leading uphill toward Mount Parker and Jardine Lookout, recognizing that control of these heights would open routes into the interior of the island. As night turned to day, combat focused increasingly on the ridges and gaps above the North Shore. Japanese companies advancing from different landing points linked up on high ground, sometimes after displacing small groups of defenders in close combat around pillboxes, cottages, or road bends. Allied units attempted to mount local counterattacks, but the fragmented nature of the landings and interruptions to telephone lines made coordinated responses difficult. Some platoons fought largely on the basis of visual contact and local initiative, without precise information on the broader situation. Wong Nai Chung Gap became a central battleground. This gap, controlling the main east-west road and access between the urban north and the coastal south, contained positions of the Middlesex Regiment, the Winnipeg Grenadiers, artillery detachments, and supporting units. Japanese infantry descending from Jardine's Lookout and adjacent slopes targeted this area to split the island's defense into separate eastern and western pockets. Repeated assaults, supported by mortars and machine guns, moved up steep tracks, led to fighting around roadblocks, buildings, and emplacements positioned to cover the gap. Some Allied positions held for extended periods, even when partially surrounded, but gradually the number of effective defenders declined as casualties mounted and ammunition stocks were depleted. Elsewhere on the island, intense engagements developed along the Repulse Bay Road, near Stanley Peninsula, and around the Tai Tam Reservoir System. East Brigade faced pressure from units pushing south from initial landing zones, while West Brigade contended with threats of encirclement if the central gaps were lost. Attempts to stabilize a continuous line across the island encountered the reality that many sectors now contained intermingled groups of attackers and defenders, with some roads and paths changing hands several times in a single day. High command decisions during this phase reflected competing priorities. Major General Maltby sought to organize counterattacks to reopen Wong Nai Chung Gap and re-establish a corridor between brigades, drawing on remaining reserves from Canadian, British, and local formations. These efforts achieved partial and temporary gains in some sectors, but could not dislodge Japanese units entrenched on key heights. Governor Young, informed of the tactical situation and the condition of civil infrastructure, weighed military reports against information from police, public works, and medical services regarding damage to utilities and civilian casualties. For the civilian population, the island phase of the battle brought sustained disruption. Shells and bombs damaged water mains and power lines. Districts on the North Shore experienced interruptions to electricity and piped water that affected hospitals, shelters, and food distribution. Residents moved repeatedly between homes, workplaces, and public shelters as front lines shifted and bombardments targeted new areas. Chinese, Indian, and European communities all faced shortages of certain goods, queues for rations, and restrictions on movement imposed to keep routes clear for military traffic and emergency services. Medical facilities operated near capacity. Military hospitals received wounded from frontline units, while civilian hospitals and improvised aid stations treated casualties from air and artillery attacks. Nurses, doctors, and orderlies from different national backgrounds worked alongside volunteer auxiliaries drawn from local organizations. The strain on staff and supplies increased as casualty numbers rose and transport became more difficult due to damaged roads and the proximity of front lines to built-up areas. On the Japanese side, divisional headquarters monitored progress through reports sent from regimental command posts established on captured heights and in commandeered buildings. Commanders adjusted artillery targets to support infantry at critical points, while engineers improved tracks, constructed temporary bridges, and prepared positions for further advances toward Victoria and the southern bays. At the same time, staff officers considered the need to conserve ammunition and manpower for subsequent operations planned in the wider theater once Hong Kong was secured. During these days, the Battle of Hong Kong reached a stage in which almost all available ground forces on both sides were engaged across a compact area of rugged terrain and dense urban development. The outcome remained undecided, but the capacity of the defenders to maneuver and reinforce was increasingly constrained by the loss of central gaps and the cumulative impact on infrastructure and civilian life. As Japanese bridgeheads on Hong Kong Island solidified, both sides adjusted their methods in an attempt to influence a battle that was increasingly defined by local initiatives rather than broad maneuvers. On the Allied side, company and battalion commanders sought to reorganize scattered units into coherent groups capable of counterattacks. Mixed formations of British, Canadian, Indian, and local troops were assembled from stragglers, reserve platoons, and specialists whose original positions had been overrun. These improvised groups launched efforts to retake sections of Wong Nai Chung Gap, high ground near Mount Nicholson, and key stretches of road, sometimes advancing without full artillery support due to ammunition constraints or disrupted communications. Defensive tactics evolved to account for Japanese infiltration techniques. Rather than relying solely on linear positions, some Allied units adopted a network of mutually supporting strongpoints in buildings, pillboxes, and trenches that could continue resistance even if neighboring posts were bypassed. Sniper and machine gun teams were placed to cover likely routes through gullies and side streets. At night, listening posts were pushed forward to detect movement, while patrols attempted to identify gaps in enemy lines that might be exploited for withdrawal or limited offensives. These measures aimed to slow the Japanese advance and preserve room for maneuver, even as the overall perimeter contracted. Japanese forces also adapted. Once initial landing successes opened access to the island interior, commanders reorganized assault companies into smaller groups suited to broken ground and urban environments. Mortars, light artillery, and machine guns were moved forward to high ground to dominate roads and junctions. When direct assaults against well-placed positions encountered resistance, units attempted to work around flanks, using footpaths, drainage channels, and vegetation for concealment. Engineers and pioneers accompanied infantry to demolish obstacles, clear wire, and, where necessary, prepare new routes for supply and evacuation of wounded. Reports from frontline officers informed adjustments in fire plans and the allocation of reserves to sectors where resistance remained strong. Resource management became a central concern for both sides. The Allied command monitored stocks of artillery shells, small arms ammunition, medical supplies, food, and fuel, knowing that resupply from outside the colony was no longer realistic. Priorities were set for ammunition distribution, favoring sectors judged essential to maintaining east-west communications or protecting reservoirs, power stations, and key harbor installations. Some heavy equipment that could not be moved was disabled or destroyed to prevent capture. Japanese commanders, aware that their division was earmarked for future operations in other theaters, aimed to complete the campaign without disproportionate expenditure of munitions or casualties, reinforcing the incentive to use maneuver and infiltration rather than repeated frontal attacks whenever possible. Psychological pressures increased as the battle continued. Allied soldiers experienced prolonged periods under artillery and mortar fire, interspersed with close-range engagements in terrain that limited visibility and made it difficult to establish clear front lines. Rumors about the situation in other sectors, the loss of central gaps, or the condition of civilian districts circulated among units, sometimes exaggerating setbacks or overlooking local successes. Japanese troops, for their part, faced continuous operations over steep terrain, exposure to fire from concealed positions, and uncertainty about the scale of remaining resistance in areas not yet fully reconnoitered. For both sides, fatigue, lack of sleep, and the demands of operating in a hot, humid environment under bombardment affected decision-making at lower levels. Civilian responses also evolved into forms of adaptation. Residents assisted in digging trenches, building barricades, and preparing sandbag walls around important facilities. Some Chinese workers in utilities, transport, and medical services continued to report for duty, despite damage to infrastructure and the proximity of front lines, contributing to the continued operation of water supply, electricity distribution in limited areas, and hospital care. Others joined organized or semi-organized resistance efforts. In the new territories and adjacent mainland districts, Chinese guerrilla groups that would later be consolidated into the East River Column began to assist Allied personnel who became separated from their units, guiding some towards safer areas or facilitating communication between urban and rural zones. Medical personnel adapted their practices to wartime conditions. Surgeons and nurses in both military and civilian hospitals reorganized wards to accommodate an increased flow of wounded, prioritizing cases according to the likelihood of survival and the urgency of surgical intervention. Improvised operating theaters were set up in basements or rooms with additional protection from shell fragments. Supplies of blood, anesthetics, and dressings were carefully rationed, and local procurement of basic materials, such as bandages and splints, supplemented official stocks. These measures did not remove the strain, but allowed treatment to continue despite infrastructure damage and intermittent power failures. Despite adverse conditions, instances of local cooperation and coordination persisted. Some Allied units, once pushed back from initial positions, established new defensive lines that held for extended periods, using detailed knowledge of nearby streets, slopes, and buildings. Japanese companies, consolidating gains, established liaison between units of different regiments, standardized signals in complex terrain, and passed on practical lessons about routes, enemy firing points, and civilian patterns of movement. The combined effect of these adaptations was to prolong active resistance beyond the rapid collapse anticipated in some early Japanese plans, even as the balance of material and positional advantages increasingly favored the attackers. By the third week of December, the cumulative effects of combat, damage to infrastructure, and loss of key terrain brought the battle to a turning point. Japanese forces had consolidated their positions on the northern slopes and central ridgeline of Hong Kong Island, while Allied units held fragmented pockets to the east, south, and west. Control of Wong Nai Chung Gap remained decisive. Despite repeated attempts by Canadian, British, and local troops to reopen this corridor, Japanese units entrenched on the surrounding heights maintained fire over the main east-west road and nearby approaches, effectively dividing East and West brigades into separate groups with constrained options for mutual support. As the gap remained closed, Japanese advances extended toward Repulse Bay, Deepwater Bay, and the approaches to Stanley Peninsula in the east, and toward Pak Fu Lam and Aberdeen in the west. Infantry companies used newly prepared tracks and captured roads to move mortars and light artillery into positions from which they could engage defensive localities and observation posts. Allied artillery batteries, limited in number and ammunition, attempted to disrupt these movements and support frontline infantry, but damage to communication lines and observation points reduced their effectiveness. Some guns were eventually overrun or disabled to prevent capture. The integrity of the island's water supply became a central strategic issue. Reservoirs at Tai Tam and other locations lay close to contested ground. Shelling and occupation of catchment areas, aqueducts, and pumping stations threatened the continued distribution of potable water to urban districts and defensive positions. Engineers and public works staff reported increasing difficulty in maintaining flow through damaged pipelines. Rationing measures already in place were tightened, and storage tanks in certain areas began to run low. The prospect of prolonged fighting under conditions of restricted water, combined with food and fuel shortages, weighed heavily in assessments at headquarters. Civilian conditions reflected this deterioration. In northern districts, including areas around Central and Wan Chai, residents relied on stored water, public standpipes, and improvised collection systems. Queues formed under intermittent shell and small arms fire. Damage to power stations resulted in extended blackouts, affecting hospitals, shelters, and communications. Medical facilities treated not only battle-related injuries, but also illnesses linked to overcrowding, limited sanitation, and stress. The colonial administration, operating from increasingly constrained premises, attempted to maintain basic services and order through police and auxiliary forces, but their capacity was limited by losses, infrastructure damage, and the shifting front line. On the Japanese side, reports to divisional headquarters indicated that organized resistance persisted in localities such as Stanley, Mount Davis, and sectors of the North Shore, but that Allied units were increasingly isolated. Commanders assessed that further pressure, applied simultaneously in multiple directions, could induce collapse without the need for prolonged building by building fighting in the central business district. Plans were made for coordinated attacks to compress remaining defensive pockets, combined with continued bombardment of infrastructure and communication centers. At the same time, staff considered administrative arrangements for an expected occupation, including the handling of prisoners of war and civil authorities. Information about the wider war influenced perceptions among both combatants and civilians. News of Japanese successes in Malaya, the Philippines, and other parts of Southeast Asia reached Hong Kong in fragments through radio broadcasts and official communiques. For Allied personnel, these reports reduced expectations of relief from outside and reinforced the understanding that the colony was operating as an isolated outpost. For Japanese troops, knowledge of progress elsewhere confirmed that operations in Hong Kong formed part of a larger pattern of advances, contributing to confidence that the campaign would conclude in their favor. Within the Allied command, discussions intensified regarding the feasibility of continued resistance. Major General Maltby and his senior officers reviewed the status of brigades, unit strengths, ammunition stocks, and the condition of key utilities. Governor Young considered military assessments alongside reports from civil departments about water, food, medical supplies, and public order. Some officers favored continued fighting, arguing that localized strong points still held, and that further delay might have political or strategic value. Others emphasized that, without water and with communications severed between major defensive sectors, the capacity to conduct organized operations would rapidly diminish, potentially leading to uncontrolled fragmentation and higher casualties among both soldiers and civilians. Japanese operations during this period included not only attacks on positions, but also efforts to induce surrender. Leaflets and loudspeaker messages called on defenders to lay down arms, stressing the disparity in strength and the absence of relief. They were addressed to British, Canadian, Indian, and local troops, as well as to the civilian population. Some individuals chose to leave contested areas or to seek safety by moving into zones already under Japanese control, while others remained in shelters or continued to support defensive efforts. Local Chinese resistance groups adjusted their activities to the changing situation. In rural areas beyond the main urban center, guerrilla elements assisted individuals who escaped from encircled positions, facilitated movement of information, and prepared for a possible transition from open battle to longer-term resistance against occupation forces. Within the city, some residents attempted to preserve records, valuables, and community structures in anticipation of a change in authority. By 24th December, the interplay of military setbacks, shortages of essential supplies, divided defensive sectors, and accumulating civilian hardship created conditions in which a decision on the colony's fate became increasingly likely. The turning point was not a single engagement, but the cumulative result of terrain, logistics, command choices, and broader strategic context. As Japanese units closed in on remaining strongpoints and civil infrastructure came under growing strain, the question facing both military and civilian leaders shifted from how to hold specific positions to whether continued combat could achieve any further strategic or humanitarian purpose. On the 25th of December, 1941, organized resistance in Hong Kong reached its final phase. Through the night of the 24th to the 25th of December, Japanese units intensified attacks on remaining strongpoints at Stanley, Mount Davis, and sectors of the North Shore. In the east, defenders around Stanley Prison and Stanley Village, including elements of the Royal Rifles of Canada, Hong Kong Volunteer Defense Corps, and other units, faced repeated assaults supported by mortars and artillery. In the west, positions near Mount Davis and Pak Fu, Lam came under pressure from infantry advancing along slopes and roads already within Japanese-controlled zones. Communications between these pockets and central headquarters were intermittent or broken. Civil infrastructure was under severe strain. Water supply from major reservoirs had been disrupted by damage to catchments and pipelines. Some districts had little or no piped water, relying on storage and improvised sources. Food stocks in military and civilian depots were diminishing, and distribution was increasingly difficult due to blocked or shelled routes. Hospitals treated large numbers of wounded, with limited supplies and reduced staff, as some personnel had been killed, injured, or cut-off shelters and basements housed civilians who had remained in the city, many of them with minimal provisions and little information beyond rumors and occasional official notices. In the morning and early afternoon of the 25th of December, Japanese forces made further gains that tightened the encirclement of key defensive areas. Elements of the 38th Division advanced toward the urban core, taking control of sections of the North Shore and extending their presence toward Central and Wan Chai. In the east, pressure increased on the Stanley Garrison. In the west, positions near Aberdeen and Pak Fu Lam became more exposed as surrounding ground fell under Japanese control. For commanders on both sides, it became clear that the remaining Allied forces were divided into isolated groups with limited capacity to mount coordinated operations. At Allied headquarters, Major General Maltby and senior officers provided Governor Young with updated assessments. Reports indicated that water could not be guaranteed beyond a short period, that ammunition for some artillery and infantry units was running low, and that routes between major defensive sectors were effectively cut. casualty figures were substantial. Among the roughly 14,500 Allied military personnel engaged in the battle, around 1,500 had been killed and nearly 2,000 wounded, with the remainder either still fighting or already captured. Japanese casualties, based on later estimates, amounted to roughly 2,000 killed and several thousand wounded. The ratio reflected both the attackers' numerical and positional advantages and the intensity of fighting in certain localities. Governor Young, responsible for both military and civilian outcomes, faced a decision between continuing resistance in fragmented pockets or seeking terms to prevent further losses. Consultations with Maltby and members of the Executive Council considered the immediate prospects for holding key positions, the condition of hospitals and utilities, and the likely consequences for civilians if street-by-street fighting reached the dense central districts. With no possibility of relief from outside and no coherent defensive line linking remaining positions, the conclusion was that continued combat would not materially change the strategic situation, but would increase casualties. In the afternoon of the 25th of December, a decision was taken to capitulate. Orders were issued for a ceasefire to be communicated to frontline units by the most reliable available means: runners, remaining telephone lines, and visual signals where possible. In practice, the transmission of these orders was uneven. Some positions received clear instructions and ceased fire. Others, cut off or doubtful about the authenticity of messages, continued fighting for some time after the formal surrender. Japanese units, likewise, did not always receive or accept immediate confirmation that hostilities had officially ended, leading to continued exchanges of fire in certain sectors before local commanders verified the new status. Formal surrender procedures required contact between representatives of both sides. Governor Young and senior officers met Japanese commanders to sign the instrument of surrender, transferring authority over the colony to the Imperial Japanese Army. The event, later widely referred to as taking place on Black Christmas, marked the end of British and Commonwealth control after nearly a century of colonial administration. For Japanese leaders, it signified fulfillment of operational objectives set before the campaign, elimination of a British base on the China coast, and availability of the 38th Division for redeployment. The immediate consequences for military personnel were reclassification from combatants to prisoners of war. Approximately 11,000 Allied soldiers and officers were taken into captivity, including British, Canadian, Indian, and local troops. They were assembled in temporary holding areas before being moved to camps within Hong Kong, and later, in some cases, to labor sites in other parts of the Japanese-controlled region. Conditions varied over time and place, but generally involved limited rations, overcrowding, and hard labor, with mortality influenced by disease, malnutrition, and inadequate medical care. For the civilian population, the transition from battle to occupation brought both relief from active bombardment and new forms of hardship. Firefighting and medical teams addressed the most urgent consequences of shelling and bombing, while families searched for missing relatives amid damaged neighborhoods. At the same time, Japanese military authorities began to impose new regulations on movement, property, and administration. Some residents faced interrogation or detention. Others returned cautiously to damaged homes or workplaces to assess losses. The colonial government as previously constituted ceased to function, and the systems through which food, water, and services had been organized had to be replaced or adapted under new control. In the days immediately following the surrender, information about events during the final hours of fighting and the surrender process spread through formal announcements, informal networks, and observation. For Allied soldiers and civilians, the end of combat was accompanied by uncertainty regarding treatment under occupation, prospects for eventual liberation, and the fate of relatives and colleagues. For Japanese troops and administrators, the focus shifted from offensive operations to the tasks of securing key installations, organizing the handling of prisoners and civil authorities, and integrating Hong Kong into a broader system of wartime governance within the region. The Battle of Hong Kong and the subsequent occupation left long-term effects that extended far beyond the 3 weeks of fighting in December 1941. Militarily, the campaign confirmed that a relatively isolated coastal outpost, without assured naval or air reinforcement, was highly vulnerable once a regional adversary achieved local superiority in air power, artillery, and numbers. Japanese forces secured their objectives within approximately 18 days, freeing the 38th Division for later operations, while integrating Hong Kong into a wider belt of occupied territories stretching from Manchuria to Southeast Asia. For Allied planners, the battle became one of several early Pacific campaigns used after the war to reassess assumptions about fortress defense, the value of fixed coastal positions, and the balance between deterrence and realistic reinforcement plans in distant colonies. Casualty figures and captivity shaped post-war interpretations. Of roughly 14,500 Allied troops engaged, about 1,500 were killed and nearly 2,000 wounded. More than 10,000 were taken prisoner. Japanese forces, with a larger contingent, suffered several thousand casualties, including approximately 2,000 killed, reflecting both their offensive posture and the intensity of fighting at particular strongpoints. Civilian deaths, from shelling, bombing, ground combat, and occupation-related causes in the weeks around the battle, reached into the thousands, although precise numbers are difficult to determine due to incomplete records and population movements. These figures entered official histories and veterans' accounts as indicators of the scale of the campaign relative to the size of the territory. The nearly 4-year occupation that followed redefined daily life in Hong Kong. Japanese military and civilian authorities reorganized administration, currency, and trade, linking the colony more closely to the wartime economy of South China and Southeast Asia. Food shortages, inflation, forced labor, and population decline through repatriation, flight, or mortality altered the demographic and economic profile of the territory. Many Allied prisoners of war were held in camps at Sham, Shui Po, Argyle Street, and other locations, later transferred in some cases to labor sites elsewhere in the region. Chinese political and guerrilla groups expanded their activities in rural areas, providing assistance to escapees and maintaining communications with Chinese nationalist and, later, Allied agencies. These experiences formed a continuous backdrop to how the brief battle itself was remembered. After Japan's surrender in 1945, British forces reoccupied Hong Kong, and the pre-war colonial administration was restored, though under changed circumstances. The battle and occupation influenced subsequent defense arrangements, including closer integration with wider Allied planning in the early Cold War era, and re-examination of the colony's role as a naval and air base. War crimes investigations and trials addressed the treatment of prisoners of war and civilians during the occupation. Testimonies from soldiers, medical staff, and residents contributed to a body of documentation that underpins later scholarship on conditions in camps, forced labor, executions, and other abuses. These proceedings did not erase the complexity of interactions under occupation, but provided a legal framework for assessing certain actions. In Canada, the dispatch and losses of Sea Force became a focal point in national memory and debate. The decision to send 2 battalions with limited trainings for tropical or urban fortress warfare to a distant theater attracted scrutiny in post-war inquiries and historical studies. Survivor accounts and official histories examined issues of readiness, equipment, and the information available to decision-makers in Ottawa in 1941. The experience of Canadian prisoners of war in Hong Kong and elsewhere in the Japanese-controlled region became an enduring part of national narratives about the conflict in the Pacific. In Britain, the fall of Hong Kong joined the loss of other Far Eastern territories in late 1941 and early 1942, as evidence of the limitations of interwar imperial defense concepts. Historians and official analysts linked the campaign to broader questions about resource allocation between European and Asian theaters, the vulnerability of scattered bases, and the speed with which regional balances of power could shift once a determined adversary seized the initiative. For British and Commonwealth veterans, however, memory of the battle often centered on unit-level experiences, the defense of specific gaps, redoubts, and districts, the conditions of captivity, and the fate of comrades. For Chinese communities in Hong Kong and neighboring Guangdong, the battle and occupation were integrated into a longer chronology of the Sino-Japanese War. The brief but intense fighting in December 1941 was one phase in a conflict that had already affected South China since 1937. Local narratives highlighted civilian displacement, economic disruption, and the emergence of guerrilla resistance in the new territories and adjacent mainland counties. After 1945, these perspectives interacted with changing political contexts in China and with the evolving identity of Hong Kong as a post-war colonial and later global city. The physical landscape of the battle left traces that influenced post-war memory. Former bunkers and pillboxes along the Gin Drinkers Line, positions at Wong Nai Chung Gap, Stanley, and other sites remained visible or were later marked by plaques, cemeteries, and memorials. Military cemeteries at Saiwan and Stanley became focal points for annual commemorations, attended by veterans, families, and officials from several countries. These sites connected local geography to international remembrance, linking individual graves and unit memorials to wider historical narratives about the Pacific War. Academic and public debates about the battle's significance have addressed several recurring themes. One concerns the extent to which Hong Kong could realistically have been held longer, given the strategic situation in late 1941. Another examines responsibility for decisions to reinforce the garrison, the quality of inter-service and international coordination, and the adequacy of preparations for occupation and prisoner of war contingencies. A third explores how different groups, British, Canadian, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, and others, have interpreted the same events through their own institutional and national frameworks, emphasizing different aspects such as tactical performance, strategic context, civilian experience, or moral responsibility. Today, the Battle of Hong Kong is remembered as a short, intense campaign that reflects the intersection of global and local dynamics in the early Pacific War. It illustrates how decisions made in distant capitals, long-term trends in regional power, and the specific features of one compact territory could combine to produce outcomes that reshaped lives for years afterwards. The legacy of the battle continues to be negotiated through scholarship, education, commemoration, and the physical evolution of the city that grew over many of the former battlefields, ensuring that the events of December 1941 remain a reference point in understanding Hong Kong's 20th century history.